Janet Yellen just revealed a diabolical government plan. And I'm going to explain this to you in 3 simple, fast steps. And make sure you stay to the end of this video because I'm going to show you how this plan could include a second central bank. That's correct. So we go from having just the Federal Reserve Bank to now we could have the Treasury Reserve Bank. More on that in step number 3. Starting off with step number 1, let's go over the power moving, transitioning, if you will, from the Fed to the Treasury. Maybe the Treasury Reserve Bank, the second central bank of these United States. But it starts off with everyone's favorite central planner, Janet Yellen herself. And she is holding a sign saying, "I am a genius." That is right. Potentially at the Wile E. Coyote level. Because she just came out with an incredibly brilliant plan. You see, in the news, she said that we need to figure out a way to increase the liquidity in the market. Oh, yes. And before you think to yourself, wait a minute, increase liquidity? Where have I heard that before? I thought that was the Fed's job. Right. Again, more on that in just a moment. So she comes out with this plan that she's kind of testing in the markets. She's throwing out that trial balloon by talking to some of the primary dealers, or so she says. Now you've got to remember, Janet Yellen is the smartest of the smart. She was the Fed chair for many, many years. She is a brilliant economist, and she surrounds herself with the smartest central planners and authoritarians in the world. So obviously, there's no way that any of us, none of you watching right now, could really come up with this type of plan. In fact, it's going to be even difficult to explain it to you because it's just so complex and really out of the box, just revolutionary. So make sure you're sitting down, put on your thinking caps, because here is Janet Yellen's brilliant plan. We have got the Treasury right here, which Janet Yellen is in charge of. So her plan is called debt buybacks. Oh, that's right. So she is going to go into the Treasury market and she is going to buy treasuries. Now, how is she going to get the money to buy treasuries? She is going to sell treasuries. So just in case you didn't pick that up, just make sure we're all on the same page here. Her genius level plan here for increasing liquidity is to sell treasuries and then buy treasuries. Absolutely incredible, isn't it? There is truly no limit to her unadulterated magnificence. That is for sure. And it's obvious why people like her should be micromanaging the entire economy and our lives. Step number 2. Now let's go over some important details. Obviously, in step number 1, I was joking around a little bit. This plan is incredibly simple, but that doesn't mean that it isn't extremely dangerous. And I think this could set a precedence that in the future, the Treasury could take more and more of the power from the Federal Reserve and become its own central bank. So let's go over some of the specifics as to what Janet Yellen was proposing. So first and foremost, the Treasury kind of floated the idea of buying off the run treasuries and selling on the run treasuries. So again, it's exactly what we talked about here, selling treasuries and then buying treasuries. but it's different types. So now I know a lot of you sitting at home are kind of scratching your head saying, okay, George, what on earth is an off-the-run treasury and an on-the-run treasury? I thought there was just 1 year, 1 month, 10-year, 30-year, etc. Actually, again, very, very simple. This first blue box represents the treasuries that were just issued at auction. And this blue box represents all the other treasuries. And you can see I've got this red line in the sand right here. And it's very straightforward. The treasuries that were just issued are the on the run, and the treasuries that were issued at past auctions, off the run. Okay, so Janet Yellen wants to issue some more treasuries. Then what happens to the treasuries that were just the newest versions or the on the run? Well, then they go over, cross the red line, and become off the run treasuries. So just in its basic explanation, the on the run treasuries are the most recent treasuries that were issued at auction. So the next question becomes, okay, why is that a big deal? Because they're a little more liquid. Usually there's a bit of a price premium, meaning the interest rate is a little bit lower, price a little bit higher because that inverse relationship. And you can look all day long online and you can't really get a straight answer as to why they are more liquid. But through several of my conversations with guys that are bond experts, it really boils down to the counterparty. So with the newest treasuries that are issued, usually those are going to be owned by the primary dealers. So to buy them or to rehypothecate them is going to be very, very easy. But a lot of these treasuries, let's say they were issued 5, 10 years ago, they're going to be owned by average Joe and Janes, they're going to be owned by pension funds, and they're just not as easy to deal with, therefore less liquid. And that's why the market prefers, at least the financial market, the financial economy, prefers these on-the-run treasuries. And again, to be very, very clear, these are much more liquid. So if there's a liquidity problem in the market that might be caused by the Federal Reserve, I don't know, doing QT, raising interest rates, doing something that the Treasury or Janet Yellen doesn't have control over, she can step in and say, okay, well, we're going to go ahead and buy some of the bad treasuries and issue more of the good treasuries. That's kind of how her proposal works. But there's also the component of an Operation Twist. Now, if you guys don't remember that, back in I believe that was Bernanke who did Operation Twist. It's just a fancy way of saying we're going to buy some bonds and sell some others, but it doesn't really get specific with the off the run and on the run. Where this gets more specific is the maturity. So you guys know from watching my videos and watching my good buddy Jeff Snyder with Eurodollar University, what drives supply and demand is much, much different with a 1-month treasury than, let's say, a 10-year or 30-year treasury. So you could run into an issue where there's a tremendous amount of demand at the short end of the yield curve, but very little demand at the 10-year, 30-year, the long end. And we saw something like this happen in the UK recently, where those 10-year, 30-year, I don't know if they have 30-year, but the 10-year gilts, which is the UK government bond, those skyrocketed in yield, meaning they tanked in price. Within about a week or two, the yield went up by 100 basis points, right around there, maybe even more. So this blew a hole in the balance sheet of all these pension funds that were levered up, that borrowed money to buy these bonds to meet their 7% obligation. So that's just an example of how the low liquidity, or I guess better said, not enough buyers, cause a big problem for the marketplace and the financial institutions. But at the same time, the 1-month gilt or 3-month, those could have been in very high demand. Plenty of buyers there. So let's look at the Treasury market because I'm a little more familiar with that. So right now, And I'm just using these numbers as examples. That these aren't specific, these aren't actual interest rates that you would see. But just as a hypothetical, let's say the Fed's reverse repo is paying 3%. So in other words, if you're this guy, the bankster, we'll call him Bankster Bob, you could just park all of your money at the Fed and get 3%. Or maybe that would be a hedge fund manager. That might be a better example. So this guy that runs, let's say, a big financial fund, he could park his money at the Fed 3%, but instead he chooses to go out and buy 1 month's treasuries at a lower yield, meaning a higher price. Well, why would he do that? Why wouldn't he just park his money here and get a much higher interest rate? Because these 1 month treasuries have tremendous value, more so even than the bank reserves themselves, i.e. cash. So he wants this 1 month treasury as collateral, and he is kind of a proxy for the financial economy. So they're willing to pay a premium. There's a lot of demand here, but he really doesn't want those 10-year and 30-year treasuries. The demand, the supply-demand dynamics there, more a result of the average Joe and Jane, pension funds, etc. So if you see the interest rate or the yield going from 4% up to 6%, let's say, in a week's time, that means a loss of liquidity. Janet Yellen would be freaking out, and so would Jerome Powell in that case. But you can have these things occur simultaneously. A lot of demand at the short end and very little demand at the long end. So going back to Operation Twist, what they could do is they could sell, when they're selling these treasuries, those could be short term, like the 1 month. And they could be buying the long end of the curve, maybe those 10, 30-year treasuries, because there's a lot less demand. So they would create more supply at the front end and create more demand at the long end, theoretically, and that is the key, creating more of an equilibrium in the bond market, or maybe targeted liquidity. Another way of looking at it, and that's probably the term that Janet Yellen and all of the central planners, the PhD economists, that's the term they would probably use. So you can see how if this plan is implemented, it'll move a lot of the power from the Federal Reserve over to the Treasury. In other words, it'll move a lot of the power from Jerome Powell over to Janet Yellen and the government. Step number 3, what is the end game? What is the objective of Janet Yellen and all of her central planning cronies? Or what is my hypothesis, to be more clear? But I do think that if they implement this plan, the direction they're going is to merge the Treasury and the Federal Reserve. So they're more like one entity. And this would mean a new central bank for the United States. It could be another one, or it could just replace the existing Federal Reserve. So, like we said earlier in the video, instead of having the Federal Reserve, now we would have the Treasury Reserve. So let's insert another character into the story. Everyone's favorite proponent of MMT, Stephanie Kelton. That's right, we haven't heard from Stephanie and the MMT crowd in quite some time. I wonder why that is. Couldn't have anything to do with inflation. No, not at all. It couldn't have anything to do with the CPI being over 8% and the whole globe now experiencing inflation from the policies that were implemented in 2020 that you could say were MMT type policies. But there is no getting around the fact that Stephanie Kelton and Janet Yellen herself are definitely BFFs. They see the world in a very similar way. So we have to understand kind of the fundamentals of MMT to understand why I believe Janet Yellen and others like Stephanie Kelton, central planners, could be pushing for the Federal Reserve and the Treasury to merge into one mega central bank. So the first step with MMT, like we said here, and this is key, is merging the balance sheet of the Fed and the Treasury. Now, in practice, would this mean there are two separate central banks? Because remember, the Fed has to micromanage the financial economy, and maybe the Treasury Reserve Bank would micromanage the real economy. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see how this plays out if this comes to fruition. But I think you're going to be hearing more and more and more of the talking heads and the media pushing for these types of ideas. The bottom line with MMT is you have much more government management, or I would say meddling, more government distortions in the real economy. So I think everyone right about now watching this video is saying, okay, George, well, if they're implementing MMT with this new central bank, well, what happens to inflation? Because right now, a lot of the MMTers, and I'm not really saying this, but you could come to the conclusion that they have egg on their face because we have seen significant, we'll call it money printing to use that term loosely, and it has definitely led to very high consumer prices. But oh, don't you worry about that, because just like their other BFF, Elizabeth Warren, they have a plan. So what they want to do is more targeted fiscal. We're using that word targeted again. And whenever they kind of imply that we need to support the economy, this is basically saying that we need to continue with stimmy checks. And they want to regulate credit. This is how they're proposing that we would tackle inflation. This is a much better way, in their opinion. And in their minds, this is a much more sophisticated strategy, almost as sophisticated as the debt buybacks we went over in step number 1. But to get more information on how Stephanie Kelton, Janet Yellen, and Elizabeth Warren would tackle inflation, editor, let's cut to the internet. And this is directly from Stephanie Kelton's Substack, where she says Senator Elizabeth Warren and Representative Ayanna Pressley were among the dozens of lawmakers who pressed Powell on the appropriateness of relying on the blunt instrument of interest rate hikes to treat inflation. Here's Senator Warren. Inflation is like and by the way, why are we taking economic advice from Elizabeth Warren, of all people? And in case you haven't heard, Pocahontas herself is one of the favorites for the next Nobel Prize in economics. Just quick FYI there in case you haven't read the news. Okay, so she says inflation is like an illness, and the medicine needs to be tailored to the specific problem. Otherwise, you could make things a lot worse. Right now, the Fed has no control over the main drivers of rising prices, but the Fed can slow demand by getting a lot of people fired and making families poorer. Yes, but actually what's making families poorer is the inflation. And the only way to tackle price inflation is to decrease demand and increase supply. Moving on. Echoing that theme, Representative Pressley said, the Fed has a role to play, but the wrong medicine can cause even more harm and make the patient even more ill. Powell pushed back, but acknowledged that interest rates and the Fed's balance sheet are famously blunt and imprecise, which led Pressley to observe, there's an old adage that if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. The Fed knows that raising interest rates will not address the root cause of rising prices. We need a more sophisticated toolkit. And you may say to yourself, okay, George, that doesn't sound too outrageous. She might be talking about the supply side, but you would be wrong. She's talking about the government just micromanaging the economy even more to manhandle those prices down to where they should be if it wasn't for those greedy capitalists. Like many of the Democrats who questioned Powell, Presley is worried about the inevitable collateral damage on people's lives and livelihoods. And just FYI, Miss Presley, when you lock people in a cage for 6 months or a year, when you shut down the global economy and you give everyone stimmy checks, you destroy the supply chains, this is what you get: consumer price inflation. Presley suggested that it might be useful for Congress to pass legislation that expands the Fed's toolkit. So what are we doing here? We're expanding what we want them to do. And I think the next step, or maybe a few steps down the road, would be just bringing the Fed right over to the Treasury and merging the two. She says, tailor a more precise response to inflation. But then, Stephanie Kelton said, her time expired before she could elaborate. So then Stephanie says what she's really talking about here is regulating the availability of credit in the specific sectors of the economy experiencing high inflation without impacting other sectors. This is the regulating of credit we talked about on the whiteboard, and this is their solution to the problem of consumer price inflation. It's interesting how we've gone from, well, the solution to inflation is just increasing taxes, to now all of a sudden it's regulating credit. Seems like with the MMT crowd, there's a moving target based on which way the political winds are blowing. So basically, you've got the Federal Reserve here and Jerome Powell holding a sign saying, "I love Paul Volcker. I want to be the next Paul Volcker. Definitely don't want to be that nerd guy, Arthur Burns. Absolutely not. I want to be the top economic G. I want to be the economic or the monetary top G, Paul Volcker." That's right. That's what Powell aspires to. But unfortunately, right now, he's got that look on his face. He doesn't know what's going on. Editor, go ahead and put up that picture that everyone loves of Mr. Jerome Powell himself really kind of puckering up a little bit because he's raising rates. He's doing QT, and he wants the unemployment rate to increase, but he's looking at what just happened in the UK, and he's saying to himself, boy, holy cow, if I keep raising rates, we don't know how this is going to end, but it might not be good. So Stephanie, Janet, and Elizabeth Warren are looking at Powell saying, "Oh, you evil, evil, evil person. Look at what you're doing to the average Joe and Jane, the poor and middle class, by raising these interest rates. How dare you do that? You're actually trying to increase the unemployment rate." Well, we know a much, much better way. Plus, if we went to the Treasury Reserve, then we could actually lower rates. And this would be far more friendly to the average Joe and the average Jane, the poor and middle class out there. We could keep doing quantitative easing, which would be great for asset prices. And this would lead to lower unemployment because through MMT, even if unemployment got down to, let's say, 2%, a historically low level, they could bring it down to 0%. How? Because they could just print more money and do a jobs guarantee program. And of course, this wouldn't exacerbate inflation. Why, you may ask? Because they're just increasing the supply of goods and services by all of these people that otherwise would have been unemployed being managed by the government themselves. Because we know how efficient the government is at producing goods and services. So all of this may seem wildly inflationary to you, but remember, they have a very sophisticated approach to tackling inflation. It's not this Neanderthal knuckle dragger, mouth breather way that Jerome Powell is implementing. Oh no, they would use this targeted fiscal, but more importantly, they would regulate credit. That is right. So let's just assume for a moment that we have car prices that are skyrocketing. Well, instead of just raising interest rates on the entire economy, no. They would just raise interest rates for the purchase of cars. And yes, this would be much, much easier with a central bank digital currency. But that's a topic for a completely separate video. So what they would do is they'd raise interest rates for the average Joe to buy the car he wanted. So it decreases his purchasing power. Now, this doesn't make average Joe too happy, but it definitely decreases aggregate demand for the cars that are going up in price. And then what they might do is decrease interest rates for a mega corporation like Ford or Tesla, one of these car manufacturers. So in their minds, this would increase supply, reduce demand, and it would bring car prices down without having to increase prices in the entire economy, which might lead to a higher unemployment rate. So again, a very, very targeted approach from the government, much more micromanagement from the authoritarians and the central planners. And I don't think any bureaucrat, politician, or central planner would pass up the opportunity to have that type of power over society. And this is why I think that in the future, you're going to be seeing an even stronger push for the second or maybe just a different central bank of the United States. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.